Good morning. I am Kay Azar. It's my pleasure to serve you this morning as the worship associate here at Uufcc. The service is being broadcast live via YouTube. And if you are at home, you can still join the virtual social hour on Zoom. Please just wait a few minutes for us to shut down the tech from the service and use the universal Zoom channel. Many thanks to our technology wizards, Corey, Sue, Tom, and Sharon. I also want to thank our musicians this morning who are not in person but have worked very hard to get us music. Jerry Cyril for the special music, Jim Boyle, Linda Himes, the Choir Choir. That's harder to say than I thought. Many thanks and kudos to the tech wizards for all of this. I also need to remind you of a few simple procedures which will help the broadcast run smoothly. If you're at home, please join us and sing along. And please have a candle or chalice available for our chalice lighting ritual. If you are new to Uufcc, we would love to have a chance to meet and chat. So if you're here for the first time this morning, and you're willing, please either stand or raise your hand and tell us your name and a little bit about where you're from. All right, everybody's here this morning. Good. Now, this is the part that I don't like. Like me, I know many people, some of the snowbirds are leaving, if not now, soon. But if you're leaving, raise your hand if you're leaving in the next week or so. So we will miss you, Stephanie. So our welcome this morning is from Andrew Backus. Come in from the heat. Make yourself a religious home, if only for a few brief moments, in spite of time, which shall soon bear us away, one from another. Make this a family. Treat us as your own. Make us a religious family, if only in this space, which we make sacred by our connections, here and beyond. Come on in, make yourself at home, sing and love life. We now have Jerry Cyril playing this morning's prelude, Schubert's Impromptus number 3 from Opus 90. Our chalice lighting this morning is by Reverend Viola Abbott. She is the minister at Coastal Virginia Unitarian Universalist in Virginia Beach, and she is currently a member of the Journey Toward Wholeness. As we light the chalice and fully embrace the sacred space created here this morning, please hold in your hearts the Unitarian Universalist principle, which calls upon us to respect the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Today we remember those who share the earth with us no longer. We bear witness to their lives and the roles they have played in ours. We pay homage to and make stronger that web which connects us all. As Lori lights the chalice here in the sanctuary, please join me in the recitation of our affirmation. Love is the spirit of this fellowship, and service is its law. This is our aspiration, to dwell together in peace, to seek truth in love, and to help one another. Please light your home chalices. Traditional people of Indian nations have interpreted the two roads that face the light-skinned race as the road to technology and the road to spirituality. We feel that the road to technology has led modern society to a damaged and seared earth. Could it be that the road to technology represents a rush to destruction, and that the road to spirituality represents the slower path that the traditional Native people have traveled and are now seeking again? The earth is not scorched on this trail. The grass is still growing there. William Commanda, Mamawanini, Canada, 1991. We'll now have the hymn For the Beauty of the Earth. So the poem Joy by William Blake has always meant the beginnings of joys and sorrows to me. So I'm going to read that this morning. Joy and woe are woven fine, a clothing for the soul divine. Under every grief and pine runs a joy with silken twine. It is right, it should be so. Man was made for joy and woe, and when this we rightly know, safely through the world we go. Each Sunday we share our joys and sorrows by entering into the book of life. Mary Jane will bring it up here now. You may enter what's on your heart here before the service, or you can email your joys, sorrows, and personal milestones to bookoflife@uufcc.org. Messages should be sent no later than Sunday prior to the service. Thank you, Mary Jane. After I've completed the reading, we'll maintain a few moments of silence and we'll be called back by the hymn Spirit of Life. And okay. Stephanie writes, heading back to Cape May, New Jersey, Thursday. Hopefully back mid-October. This morning to introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Jennifer Zobaline from the historian for Charlotte County. She received her PhD from Kansas State University in 2018, where she examined how the United States utilized war memorials and soldier poetry to commemorate the First World War. Jennifer's also worked for the New York Historical Society, the National Park Service, and the National World War I Museum and Memorial. Since joining the Libraries and History Division in 2019, Jennifer has worked on a variety of programming and outreach while also contributing to Charlotte County's 2021 Centennial Celebration. Her topic, the Colusa Indians, is one I had expressed an interest in, and I'm so glad that I get to be Worship Associate this morning when she's presenting. Here's Jennifer.
Good. Is
If it's not, we'll manage. I can just talk up here.
We don't have any sound on the mic. You have headphones on, Corey.
There we go. All right, well, good morning, and thank you, Kay. Thank you all so much for having me here this morning, for welcoming me here this morning. As Kay said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Calusa this morning. And keep in mind that this is going to be a relatively concise overview, right? In 20 to 30 minutes, we don't have too much time to go into incredible detail. So what I will do is kind of talk a little bit about indigenous peoples in Florida, kind of even before the Colusa, and then we'll look a little bit at the Colusa, and then we'll look at kind of how the dynamics in Florida change after the arrival of the Spanish. All right, Corey, next slide, please. All right, so the people first arrived in Florida over 12,000 years ago. And again, I'm not going to go into too much here, but I do think it is important to kind of set the stage for you. So if you look at that image there on the left, you can see how much Florida's coastline has changed. So if we think about Florida during the last ice age, right, sea levels were much higher, or much lower rather, and the coastline of Florida actually extended 100 miles further out into the Gulf of Mexico than what it does today. So this was a very different landscape. This was a landscape that featured mammoths and saber-toothed tigers. All of these things that we think of when we think of the Ice Age would have been here in Florida. These early Paleo-Indian peoples that would have been in here, say 12,000, 10,000, 9,000 years ago, we don't have too much information about them, but based on the little that we do know with their stone tools and things, again, archaeology is very key here, and that'll be a common theme throughout what I'm going to talk to you about today. It is these Paleo-Indians who are going to, of course, like in other places, drive many of these Ice Age creatures to extinction. And we see this everywhere. This is not just in Florida. We see it throughout what is now the United States as well. About 9,000 years ago, the glaciers began to melt, and Florida's climate changes. It becomes warmer and wetter, and plants and animals in the region become more diverse. Between 7,000 and 6,000 years ago, when the modern forests and wetland environments began to appear, people in Central and South Florida practiced a very unique custom of burying their dead in wetland cemeteries. And again, archaeology is what is driving all of this, right? There is no written record, so we cannot rely on that. So the archaeological record is very critical to our understanding of all of these people. And about 4,000 years ago, conditions in Florida reach what we are familiar with now, or at least in the sense of what we know of as Florida in terms of the coastline, in terms of the natural environment. And you start to see a heavier reliance on wetland environments for food sources. So rather than saying hunting large animals, which those large animals are now gone, now you're seeing a reliance more on the sea, on shellfish, on turtles, but you still do see deer, raccoon, those sorts of things as well, which we don't always see too much today, but they are there. And again, the archaeological record is giving us these clues as we go on. By about 1,000 years ago, so we're getting there, we're getting a little bit closer to the Colusa, right? So about 1,000 years ago, this is really where we see the diverse indigenous populations of Florida, like what I have on the map there. It's not on the image on the right. It's not the best image because of the watermarking, but it was the best one that I could find in the sense of to give you a sense of the diversity of peoples in Florida. Kind of in the last 1,000 years and then kind of leading up to the arrival of Europeans. So you can see the Calusa there on the bottom left, right? Kind of where we are in Southwest Florida. But then you can see the Tocabega. They were a very large tribe out of the Tampa Bay area. There's many others as well. And these names are still with us, right? So if you're driving around Florida, keep an eye out, right, in terms of river names or even national forest names or things like that. These names are still here. We just don't necessarily put the two and two together and piece them with that indigenous past. So by about 1,000 years ago, the indigenous peoples living in the Panhandle are practicing extensive agriculture. So we're talking corns, beans, squash. Kind of like what we think of when we think of native peoples in, say, the Northeast or even like in Virginia, right? We think, right, the corns, beans, squash, those are kind of the ABCs of Native American agriculture. However, in South Florida, they are not practicing agriculture because it is not really possible to practice agriculture in Southwest Florida. And why? Because it's too wet. It is simply, the environment here is simply not made to handle large-scale agriculture. So what you see instead is a reliance on the marine environment. What makes the Calusa unique, as we'll see, is that they are able to build a complex society that does not rely on agriculture. And typically, complex societies are strongly associated with agriculture, but the Calusa are not going to be. Next slide, please. So who are the Calusa, or who were the Calusa? And just a word about these images. So these images that I'm going to be showing you on the next few slides, these all come from the Florida Museum of Natural History. They had an artist that did renderings to imagine what the Calusa life or the Calusa culture would have looked like. These drawings are based on the archaeological discoveries. So they took the archaeological record, they took the Spanish sources, and they combined them to create these images. And I wanted, I thought it would be, rather than trying to, not have anything, which I don't enjoy not having images in slides, that isn't fun. I thought that we would use these because it does give an accurate depiction, or at least the most accurate that we can possibly give of what the Calusa were like. So again, this is a record that is based on two things, archaeology and the Spanish. So the Calusa were part of what was called the Caloosahatchee culture, right? We all know the Caloosahatchee River. So the Caloosahatchee culture is centered in South Florida, Southwest Florida, stretches from Estero Bay to Charlotte Harbor and eastward to Lake Okeechobee. The idea, and it is believed that the Caloosahatchee River was actually the highway of the Calusa, right? So this is how they are traveling from Estero Bay, Charlotte Harbor area to Lake Okeechobee. So they cover, that whole territory is their territory. And the Calusa will wield extensive influence in those, say, 500 years or so before the Spanish arrive. So after the year 1000, the Calusa grow in size and complexity. They are militarily powerful. They trade very widely. They have folks who are not subservient, but who are certainly under their influence. So while there are other independent tribes in South Florida, the Calusa are wielding political and even some military influence over them. So again, we're not talking a small society here, we're talking a very large, complex society. The Calusa are also known as the first shell collectors. So shells and shell middens are incredibly important to the Colusa culture, and this is one of the strongest evidences that we have of their culture, right? This was key for archaeologists in determining, in kind of piecing this story together. And, you know, I think it's interesting because typically we think, oh, the Europeans, right, the Spanish arrive, and we can read about, you know, when the Spanish, you know, take over the Aztec and the Inca in Central and South America, right, and the corruption of those stories. And do we really know those stories? Because the Spanish are writing, you know, with certainly their own bias, both a religious bias, a cultural bias. And that was believed to be the case here, too, because there were Spanish records of the Colusa, right, the interactions with the Colusa, what that society was like. But it turns out that actually the Spanish weren't off the mark. So there's a story, one of the more famous tellings was in 1566. There was a very large Spanish gathering led by Pedro Menendez de Aviles, who was the first governor of Florida. He was the first Spanish governor of Florida, founder of St. Augustine. And he arrives on Mound Key, which is south of here, in what is now Lee County, to meet with the Calusa king, Calusa. And again, whether that is the actual, right, we don't know what the Colusa would have called themselves. The Calusa, Carlos, or Calus, these are all from the Spanish. So we don't know how accurate that may have been. So we have this large gathering, Menendez and his men, and Calus, and the Colusa warriors, and everything, right? And there's this whole depiction of this, right? And you think, well, how accurate could this possibly be, right? Well, only within the last 15, 20 years, archaeologists on Mound Key proved that actually that whole gathering, that was accurate. And that Mound Key was, in fact, the capital of the Colusa kingdom. And they were able to determine that by doing extensive archaeology on Mound Key. And so it confirmed that not only was it the capital, but it also revealed the extent of the landscape alteration, of how the Colusa changed their land, the landscape around them. So again, we think of native peoples as, you know, we compare native peoples with Europeans in the sense that Europeans come in and destroy the land and use the land for their own purposes. Indigenous peoples did that too. They just did it in a different way, but they still did it. They still manipulated their landscape. They still used that land to how they needed it, right? It is estimated now, based on archaeology, that the Colusa kingdom possibly grew as high as 20,000 people at its height. Right, and it could have been larger before the Spanish, but that was the estimate at that time. And given the results of the research, the Colusa are considered now one of the most politically complex group of non-agriculturalists in the ancient world. And again, emphasis on non-agriculture. We think of large societies, the Aztec, the Maya, we think of others in Mesopotamia, right? The dependence on agriculture. The Colusa did that without relying on agriculture, and that really tells us a lot. Next slide, please. One of the other important centers of the Colusa was on Pine Island, the Pineland area. This is the Randall Research Center. If anybody's ever been to the Randall Research Center on Pine Island, that research was done in the last 15, 20 years. You can walk a path. They have a nature trail out there that has signage that talks about the Colusa, talks about the canals that they built on Pine Island. And today, you're looking at about a 200-acre archaeological site that was occupied by the Colusa for what is estimated to be about 1,500 years. So this was, again, so Mound Key, Pine Island, these areas were incredibly important to the Colusa. So even though their society or their influence covers much of South Florida, and certainly Southwest Florida, right? These two sites in particular are really at the heart of their culture. One of the things that always, struck, or something that researchers, historians, archaeologists always debated, was how the Colusa could have sustained a high population. So how are you able to sustain a population of people, over 20,000 people, without agriculture? How do you do it? How do you simply rely on the marine environment to feed all of those people? So archaeologists in 2017 determined that the answer lie in what were called the water courts. The water courts. So these were rectangular structures built of shell and sediment that enclosed large areas on both sides of the mouth of Mount Key's Great Canal, which was a marine highway about 2,000 feet long and 100 feet wide that bisects the island. And they determined that the enclosures, which were built on a foundation of oyster shells, walled off portions of the estuary, serving as traps and short-term holding pens for fish. So essentially, the Colusa, right, built these large pens for the fish, and now you don't have to actually go and spend the energy, right, to hunt the fish. You've already have them trapped. So now it's just a question of catching them, eating them as you need, and then periodically you get more into the holding pen. And so it's this system, the water courts, that are able to sustain the Colusa population. So, and again, without archaeology, we would have never known this, right? We would have never understood how the Colusa were able to do this for so long. And so several archaeologists, right, highlight the importance of this, right? They say the archaeology of the Colusa is important worldwide in that it illustrates the development of a very pronounced hierarchy, inequality, monumentally and large-scale infrastructure by hunter-gatherer fisher societies. The immensity of the king's house, this was Calusa's house on Mount Key, which the Spanish described and archaeology proved was correct, as well as the huge shell mounds and the canals required large amounts of labor and mechanisms to mobilize and to organize that labor, which he thinks are indicative of a lower class that would have worked at the behest of the Colusa elites. And we see this in other indigenous societies. You see this with the Maya, the Aztec, and the Inca. They all have a dominant hierarchy class system, right? Not necessarily, right, elites and slaves, but elites and workers, right, where society is very much divided. The Colusa case also illustrates remarkably sophisticated engagements with and long-term large-scale management of the coastal and estuarine environments. So long before, right, Europeans, the Colusa were effectively managing the landscape around them and making it work for them and are sustaining them over a long period of time. Next slide, please. So the Spanish will arrive in Florida for the first time in 1513. This is the very famous voyage of Ponce de Leon, right, who is the first European to discover La Florida, right? So Ponce de Leon sailing out of Cuba, which was already in the hands of the Spanish. Initially, it is believed that Florida is an island, right? It is not yet understood until later that Florida is part of a much larger physical body. It is believed to just be another island like the Bahamas or like Cuba, things like that. Only later do they realize how large it actually is. So 1513, Ponce de Leon makes the first contact with the Colusa. This was not their first contact with the Spanish, however. The Colusa actually knew who the Spanish were from native peoples who had fled Cuba. After the Spanish took Cuba, you had native peoples in Cuba who flee Cuba, and they, right, Cuba to Florida, right, the Straits of Florida, not very large, and very easy to cross, relatively, if you know what you're doing, which of course they did. And so the Colusa knew who the Spanish were, right, and in fact, it's very interesting because the Colusa, right, get their nickname, the fierce people. That comes from the Spanish. It was the Spanish who recognized the powerhouse that the Colusa were. And in 1513, and even later in 1521, when Ponce de Leon comes back, the Spanish are no match for the Colusa. They just simply aren't. And the Colusa aren't interested in anything the Spanish have to offer. They're not. Right, they're perfectly fine themselves. And actually, in that second encounter in 1521, Ponce de Leon is mortally wounded by Colusa warriors, and he will die, actually, back in Cuba. And so it's a very interesting kind of first contact story of the Colusa being this dominant kingdom, this dominant powerhouse, and the Spanish not really being a match for them. Now, the Spanish will come back. You have subsequent expeditions in southwest Florida in 1528, 1539, 1549, right? And again, so there is this back and forth contact, but there's no takeover. And at no point in time are the Spanish going to take over and defeat the Colusa. That's not going to happen. So it is a very different story than, say, what we see in Central and South America, or even what we see, right, with the English in, say, Massachusetts and Virginia, right, where there is this kind of takeover, this forced exodus of the native peoples. We don't see that here, right? And look, Florida is a really hostile environment. Right, and I think that is an important consideration. Not to say that the Virginia wilderness or even Massachusetts wasn't wild in its own way, but Florida is a whole nother animal. It really is, right? And the Colusa are very powerful. They are a very, very powerful kingdom, and the Spanish have limited resources. Right, and the Spanish are, you know, it's not like the English where it's like, we're going to build a fort here and we're going to stay here and we're going to live here and we're going to bring more people. The Spanish takeover or colonization of Florida is a very different, it plays out very differently than what you see in the English colonies. And I definitely think that plays a role into how and why the Colusa are able to sustain themselves, right? So you don't have, you know, mass death, right, or by disease or in battle here in Southwest Florida. You don't see that. Now, again, we have that big meeting on Mound Key, right, between Aviles and Calusa, right, and where this demonstration of power on both sides, right? Certainly the Spanish were made to come to Mound Key and, you know, and you can see the depiction there, right? That is no small feat, right? And this is certainly a demonstration of the authority of the Colusa, right? As much as the Spanish are coming with their horses, with their guns, right? So both sides here are demonstrating power. But, you know, after Aviles, you know, kind of, there's this tentative agreement, right? But the Colusa aren't interested in missionaries. They're not interested in converting to Christianity or anything like that. They're perfectly happy not accepting anything from the Spanish. That includes goods. That includes, you know, everything. And interestingly, after the meeting, this big meeting between Aviles and Calusa in 1566, you're not really going to see any interaction between the Colusa and the Spanish for the next 50, 60, even 70 years. There will be some military attacks in the early part of the 17th century, right? But again, the Colusa are able to defend themselves. You do have a major Spanish expedition in 1680, which was designed to, right, kind of go in there, take captives, and bring the Colusa kingdom down. It completely fails. It completely fails. And again, Spanish resources in Florida, right, are just there, and Florida itself presents a very heavy challenge. And remember, the Spanish, you know, if we put this in perspective, Florida is a very small part of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. A very small part, right? The money, you know, where is the money for the Spanish in the Americas? It's in Central and South America. It's in Cuba, right? Florida is not a moneymaker. It's not. It's not. Right? And so you've got St. Augustine, and you have Pensacola, and everything else, right? And you do have, actually, and I'm going to be talking about this with another group tomorrow, you do have an extensive cattle industry in Florida that you have both Spanish, English, and Indians participating in, right? But that's it. You know, it really just is not this driving economic force. And that really does benefit the Colusa, right? And again, there's various missionary attempts. You have Franciscan monks who try to establish missions, and they're somewhat successful in northern Florida, and I say somewhat successful. In South Florida, it's a complete disaster. The Colusa and those that are under the influence of the Colusa have no interest. And, you know, I think it's interesting, right? If we think about those folks who are under the influence of the Colusa, right, there's probably a fear of reprisal by the Colusa if they go in with the Spanish, right? Because again, the Colusa are still able to wield that military might. And so, kind of to sum this all up, right? The Colusa resisted all attempts to convert them to Christianity, remaining true to their own beliefs. They still lived in their homeland and exerted influence on neighboring polities as late as 1698. 1698. Long after the ravages of European diseases, forced labors, and warfare had devastated North Florida populations, let alone what becomes the English colonies, right? That had been a complete disaster. So if you think about the Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia, if you think about the Wampanoags in New England, right? Those societies had been catastrophically brought down and destroyed by English and other, mostly the English. And then in North Florida, because the Spanish do exert control right between the St. Augustine and Pensacola. So those societies in northern Florida don't fare very well. But in South Florida, the Colusa are able to hang on until very, very late. Next slide, please. So what is going to change? Because the Colusa do not exist today. In any form, they are not part of the Seminole, right? They do not exist. Their culture is gone and has been gone now for a couple hundred years. So what happens? Well, right, so much pressure, right? I mean, right, they are able to withstand all of this outside influence for a very long period of time, much longer than almost anyone else, at least at this point in time and at least on the eastern coast, right? However, what is going to start to change in the early 18th century, as the English are expanding west, right? So you have the original 13 colonies, but then you have people driving west, right? So you have native groups like the Yamasees in the Carolinas or the Creeks in Alabama, Georgia, who are now feeling that pressure, okay? And they are now being forced to flee. And where do they flee? They flee south to Florida because it was still controlled by the Spanish. So the idea was that there would be some protection, right? Because the Spanish, interestingly enough, were seen to be different in a more positive way than the English colonies. And so you see this migration of the Creeks in particular into Florida. And the Creeks are, they are very powerful in their own right. They may be being driven from their homes, but they are very powerful in their own right. And they are going to completely change, right, the Native American dynamic in Florida, right? Because now they are able to come in and they are now starting to exert influence. And this is going to be what is going to start to drive the Colusa culture essentially into extinction, because you now have the Creek and the Yamasee who are under pressure. They're now moving into Florida. They're raiding Colusa populations, right? Again, it's this vicious cycle, right, of trying to preserve yourself. I mean, if you've ever heard or ever read about the stories surrounding the African slave trade, right? Why is the African slave trade so successful? It's not because of the Europeans, right? It's because the Europeans were able to manipulate African tribes against one another, right? So you have Africans capturing Africans and selling them into slavery, right? To hopefully save yourself, right? I mean, that's what it is. It's a self-preservation. So if we do this, if we sell our enemy to the Europeans, to these white men, right, we can preserve ourselves. The Creek and the Yamasee are not very different, right? It is a survival. So if we do this, if we attack these civilizations, the Colusa, right, in Florida, we can preserve ourselves, right? So interestingly, what happens, so the Creek and some others, the Creek, that's who becomes the Seminole. Seminole is a word that's not a tribe. The Seminole don't exist as a tribe, as an entity, before the 18th century. They come into existence as kind of this polyglot of peoples who band together for survival. And ultimately, they become the powerhouse in South Florida, and the Colusa are wiped out, right? Which is why now when we think of South Florida, we think of the Seminole, right? So essentially by the 1750s, the Colusa culture, the Colusa kingdom have completely collapsed. Last slide, please. So this is, right, again, we had to do the whirlwind tour, as I always say. But I will be staying around afterwards, so if anyone has questions, if you want to talk more, I can certainly do that. However, I would just highlight some of the resources that are out there. The Florida Museum of Natural History, fantastic. That's where all these images came from. It is their archaeologists that have really been driving this discovery or rediscovery of the Colusa kingdom and who these people were. If you're able to get out to Pine Island, go to the Randall Research Center. They have great folks there. That's run by the University of Florida. So again, very academically and archaeologically based. You can also go out to Mound Key. It is a state park, but it is accessible only by boat. But you can go out there and you can actually see all the remnants of the middens and everything like that. And Mound House, which is on the mainland, also does interpretation of all of this as well. So those are just some of the resources that are out there if you want to learn more about the Colusa, right? I am the historian of Charlotte County, but I don't pretend to be an expert on the Colusa. And so these folks are the experts. And so I would highly encourage you to look into that if you are interested. And again, I am happy to answer questions after the service.
That was awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. Nice to know where we come from and whose lands we're living on. It's actually a perfect time, given that this is a week of Earth Day. A Greater Good for Ourselves and the World by Kayla Parker. We know that our financial contributions to this congregation come from sacrifice and hard work. And we're so grateful for this and commit together to ensure the funds we gather collectively to do a greater good for ourselves and our world than they could have done alone. May there be an offering to sustain and grow the life and mission of this congregation. May we give in love and in hope. The offering is a sacrament of the Free Church. It is supported by the generosity of all who join us. There are several ways you can give. You probably know them by heart now. Checks to the office, drop them in the mailbox. You can go through Venmo or call the office and make other arrangements. And there's always the baskets that will be coming around. Your generosity is always appreciated. And if you are with us for the first time, do not feel obligated to give today as you are our guests. Now we'll be singing the hymn, The Earth is Our Mother. This is hymn 1073 from Singing the Living Tradition. The song comes from Songs for Earthlings, edited by Julie Forrest Middleton and performed by Sandy E.
The earth is our mother, we must take care of her. The earth is our mother, we must take care of her. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. Her sacred ground we walk upon, with every step we take. Her sacred ground we walk upon, with every step we take. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. The earth is our mother, she will take care of us. The earth is our mother, she will take care of us. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. The sky is our father, we will take care of him. The sky is our father, we will take care of him. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. The sea is our sister, we will take care of her. The sea is our sister, we will take care of her. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. The forest is our brother, we will take care of him. The forest is our brother, we will take care of him. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan. Hey yana ho yana, hey yan yan.
Now, life of the community. It's a time to highlight the UUFCC special events and activities. Please remember to religiously read your weekly copy of the updates. There is a calendar and links for connecting with Zoom. The updates gives you lots of important information and a means for staying connected in these challenging times. Additionally, if you would like to have fellowship events highlighted during this service, you can email them to the worship associates at bookoflife@uufcc.org. Today I have a couple of announcements. The first one is the Art Committee meeting is today at noon in the social hall. There will be a fundraiser by the Immigration Justice Committee at Visani Restaurant and Comedy Club. Tickets are $10. The date is May 25th, 2022. We get to keep the $10. You, the ticket holder, must show up the day of the show and order a drink or two or a meal. Please email Visani at laughatvisani.net and confirm that you will be there on the day of the show, March 25th. May 25th. Too close. Doors open at 5 p.m. for dinner, and the show starts at 7:30 p.m. Visani accepts all major credit cards. Other announcements. The Buddhist Meditation and Discussion Group will be meeting this is a change, on the 2nd and 4th Tuesdays of the month, starting in May. Thursday, you're right. I can't read. The 4:30 time remains the same, and the change in schedule was made to accommodate a change in when the board meets, and the board deeply appreciates their the willingness to make that change. So, 2nd and 4th Thursdays of the month starting in May. You can now listen to the weekly updates being read by our own Herb Levine. If you find it difficult to read the updates on the screen, or you just want to listen to being read to by a soothing, mellow voice, check it out on the UUFCC website at uufcc.org/weekly. This is really an important forum, I think. You're invited, the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Venice is having a community forum Sunday, May 1st at 4 p.m. in their sanctuary. It's free and open to the public. It is on recent Supreme Court decisions affecting church and state. The name of the presentation is How Strong is the Wall of Separation, and the presenter is attorney Alex Bodikin. Panel discussion will follow. It is the UUCOV is at 1971 Pine Brook Road in Venice. Remember, it's there, not here. Again, don't forget to read your updates. You'll be glad you did. Mary Jane's musings are terrific, as always. And they were good this week. There were no pictures of baby animals. And you'll find out how active we are despite the pandemic. So closing words for this morning are by Kimberly Quinn Johnson. Reverend Johnson is the minister of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the South Fork in Bridgehampton, New York. Among her specialties are anti-racism and youth ministry. We are the ones we have been waiting for. We are not perfect, but we are perfectly fitted for this day. We are not without fault, but we can be honest to face our path as we chart a new future. We are the ones we have been waiting for. May we be bold and courageous to chart that new future. May we have faith in a future that is not known, as we are the ones we have been waiting for. Now it is time to extinguish the chalice. Please join me in our traditional recitation as Lori extinguishes the chalice. We extinguish this chalice, but not the light of hope, the fire of commitment, or the warmth of community. May those ideals shine in our lives and warm our hearts until we are together again. Go now in peace, and you will hear the song shortly.
Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the Spirit of us surround you everywhere, everywhere you may go. Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the Spirit of love surround you everywhere, everywhere.
Thank you all. Yeah, I was gonna say that.